So moving on, part of our step one is a document checklist. And this is the handout that you should have downloaded by now. And if you don't have it, go to globalira.org, or you can give us a call on the number below and we can help you with this information. But on the document checklist, this is really critical because every kind of transaction is going to be different. This document checklist you will not find at your self-directed custodian. The self-directed custodian will have their own checklist, but that's to satisfy their paperwork. That will not necessarily finish closing an international real estate transaction or complex transactions. Those documents are going to have some necessary checklists, but it's not all that you need to finish the transaction. And this is one of those places where you can get all the way 99 yards down and you could be 1 yard close to the goal line, but if you can't cross that last yard, you cannot close your transaction. Now, I've seen instances where people were looking to buy and do complex transactions in their IRAs, and they were not able to complete that one last bit of paperwork. That may sound strange. You may say, well, oh, come on, Brett, how come they couldn't just finish that last piece of paperwork? Well, in many instances, particularly when you're dealing with international transactions, you might be asked for documentation that you simply can't get your hands on. Let me give you an example. In a case where an individual was looking to buy a piece of real estate and they were going to buy that real estate inside of a corporation, the seller, who was an individual who was a farmer who was located in a rural area in a rural part of the world, where the buyer was not able to get the necessary documentation from that seller because the seller just didn't keep their records. The seller, while they owned the property, or at least they claimed to own the property, they could not get their hands on the actual stock of the corporation which owned the real estate, thereby absolutely killing the deal. So there was, and I've seen this time and time again, where individuals wanted to purchase different assets inside their IRA, and these maybe international assets, and in order to do so, they had to get their hands on the share documents as well as the corporate documents. And if you're looking at a corporation that's located somewhere in the world and maybe in a rural area, or if you're buying something where someone does not have all of their paperwork, you may have a lot of difficulty in obtaining that paperwork, and then the existing custodian may also require an official notarized translation by the U.S. consulate of that particular country in order to complete the transaction. Things like that are things that people don't think about when they're going into a complex transaction that they're going to be buying in their IRA. And typically, they'll hear from a broker or they'll hear from an attorney or a CPA somewhere where they would say, oh yeah, sure, you could just buy that in your IRA. But what they don't know is the very intense, detailed checklist that you must complete to get you all the way to the finish line. For example, the account application and fee schedule, those things are pretty easy. Rollover forms, those are fairly standard. Direct rollover request forms, those things are important. A buy authorization, a purchase agreement, now we're looking at something a little bit more complex. The purchase agreement is going to be done by the attorneys. Well, if your purchase agreement is not done in English, you might be required to get an official translation. Then you might also be required to take that official translation to the U.S. consulate and get it officially notarized. And that may be much more difficult. And I've seen cases where people have lost sales or they've lost the ability to purchase a particular asset because of that issue specifically. You might have to have an estimated settlement statement. A lot of times, something that sounds simple like wiring instructions and international wiring and authorization forms may sound pretty simple, but a lot of times we've seen deals actually fall through because individuals were not able to get all of the necessary information to wire something in a timely fashion. Closing proxy to appoint manager, special power of attorney, a quota, and a share transfer agreement. Those kinds of closing documentations aren't necessarily on your document checklist that you may get from the individual custodian. So these are the kind of things that we know how to ask for and we know how to get, and we have those kinds of proper documentations to help you get through that first really critical step of buying international real estate in your IRA. Now, let's go to the process. So we're setting up a self-directed account. And that's, again, the easy step. So maybe you have 7 documents and maybe around 45 pages. Then the next step, rolling over IRA assets to an account. 3 forms, 20 pages, potential notary. Now, just this little simple issue of a notary where other custodians may require what's called a gold medallion signature. I've seen that kind of thing hold up rollovers for a month, which in turn holds up a closing process, which in turn causes people to actually lose their purchase. The agreement documents. Now, this is where the attorneys that you're working with need to set up the correct purchase and sale agreement. Now, this is really critical when you're looking at the purchase and sale agreement, because now we're going to be setting up corporate documentations, escrow, and the purchase and sale agreement. If your IRA is going to be buying a particular asset, you're not going to be signing for that. The custodian is going to be signing on your behalf. So you need to have it properly titled. Well, if you're working with an attorney that is outside the United States who doesn't have a lot of experience with closing IRA transactions, or I've even seen instances where attorneys claim to have a lot of experience with IRA transactions, but they really don't fundamentally understand how they work, that in and of itself can really stymie a deal, and it can also cause potentially disastrous consequences if the documentation is not properly set up. So, the next phase, if you're looking for the purchase authorization and accompanying documentation, might be 2 forms per transaction. And a lot of times in these transactions, there may be multiple parties who are buying. If we're looking at a large transaction, there may be multiple parties buying in with their IRA. That just compounds the potential for a mistake. I got to have those outgoing wiring instruction forms. That's not a big deal, but I, again, have seen instances where that has completely shut down a transaction, along with the payment authorization forms, to making sure that the payment comes out of the escrow properly and comes out of the IRA properly. Now, on the next slide, we mentioned outgoing wiring instruction forms, execution and agreement of corporate documents. So I've seen corporate documents that are completely in Spanish, completely in Dutch, completely in different languages. Well, if the custodian is a US-based, English-speaking custodian, they don't have any way to know that these documents are legitimate. They may require a translation of the entire document. They need to have proof, and there are times when they need to have the official U.S. consulate of the respective country give an official notary to make sure that that particular transaction gets closed. Again, this is the kind of thing that's in our checklist that we make sure is going to be part of the process. And then when it comes to closing escrow, there are many escrow companies outside the U.S. that are not familiar with U.S. IRA rules and how they work. And many times we've seen escrow companies or individuals who are doing specific purchases where they may be buying one asset with their personal money, they might be buying another asset with their IRA money and using the same escrow company. And I've seen instances where people have thought that they could help to close escrow by using some personal money in transactions where people were going to actually be making the purchase in their IRAs. That, again, is a violation of rules that can cause a potentially disastrous consequences to your IRA. So those are exactly the kind of things that we help avoid and working with our checklist and going through the process. Closing documentation is very important. The requiring closing documentation to the custodian many times is different than the closing documentation that's going to be going to the escrow company and to the real estate company and their respective attorneys. And then finally, having the file and all the documents in a safe place, all neatly organized in an electronic file, is something that a lot of people really don't pay enough attention to. And when they're going back through old files for old transactions, when it comes time to sell the asset their IRA owns or liquidate it, a lot of times the files are buried way back in some respective folder, or there's fax copies that have been faxed internationally several different times that are almost illegible. It's really helpful to have all those files in a neatly organized place so that they can be easily accessed.